I'm here to give you a sort of curtain raiser, as it turns out, for the discussion that will start tomorrow afternoon about post-market monitoring. The presentations tomorrow will be very much on the practical side of things, about how you might do post-market monitoring, but really I'd like to explain to you how it's seen from the regulator's side. I'm, as it says on the slide, Sandy Lawrie, and I'm the head of the Novel Foods Unit within the UK Food Standards Agency. And we are the government department which is responsible for novel foods and for GM food legislation in the UK. So if I can move forward, I'd like to say a little bit, and I think this is probably known to most of you, so I'll be very quickly over that, the current legislation on GM food and feed, and then talk in a bit more detail about what this legislation says about post-market monitoring. I should stress here I'm talking about post-market monitoring in the context of safety for human and animal consumers, and not in terms of environmental risks, which is a whole different topic, and one which I don't feel qualified, and it's not relevant to the project anyways. It's interesting then to look and see how post-market monitoring works in other areas of EU legislation where it has already been applied, so I'll say a little bit about that, and then maybe give you an insight into the current thinking about post-market monitoring in relation to GM food and feed, because there is an actual discussion going on at this very moment. And the main piece of legislation that's relevant to the safety of GM food and feed is, of course, Regulation 1829/2003. This is our one-stop shop for the approval and also for reauthorization, because all the approvals are now limited for 10 years, of GM crops and for GMOs used for food and feed. And this covers, because it's a one-stop shop type approach, it covers cultivation, it covers import of the GMO and the environmental consequences of those. It covers the marketing of food and feed that contain a GMO or which are derived from a GMO. And it also talks about labelling of food and feed as supplied to the farmer and to the eventual consumer. And I should stress here, and this is sometimes surprising to people, that there are of course two levels to European legislation, well there are three, but two that are relevant here. One of which is the ordinary legislative process, which is the GM food and feed regulation as a product of that. This is legislation decided on by government ministers from across the whole of the EU and by the European Parliament. And then we have implementing acts, which is where the Commission is entitled, because of powers given to it by the Parliament and by the Council of Ministers, the Commission is entitled to introduce more technical measures. So for example, on GM, the individual authorisation requests are dealt with under implementing acts, and it's a Commission decision at the end of the day, not a Council and Parliament decision. And the Commission can also come up with new legislation in areas like the enforcement of low-level presence of GM materials in animal feed, so we have an effective tolerance for low-level presence in feed at the moment, and that's done under an implementing act, which is the second level. Just thought it was interesting for those who are not maybe so familiar with the European system to understand that. So, our GM food and feed regulation says that GM food and feed must not, three criteria, must not present a risk to the consumer or to the animal, it must not mislead the consumer, and it must not be nutritionally disadvantageous. Sorry, this is stumbling over that complicated wording. I found no other simpler words for describing that, and this is compared with food or animal feed which might be replaced by the GM product. There's another criterion, so even if you tick these three boxes, you won't get your authorization unless there's a validated detection method that's available. I was thinking about adding another criterion on the bottom, which is that you have to get support from a sufficient number of member states, but I'm not quite sure how often we actually manage to achieve that in practice. We get a numerical majority, but not the qualified majority that the legislation demands. That's a separate topic for another day, nothing to do with post-market monitoring. I said 1829, the regulation on GM food and feed, was the main piece of legislation. There is, of course, also a directive, which is to do with what's called the deliberate release of GMOs to the environment. This is very relevant for the legislation we have on food and feed, because it actually provides our definition of what GM is. The regulation I mentioned before doesn't say what GM is, it just says it means whatever it means in this earlier directive from 2001. And of course, 2001-18 is very much about environmental risk assessment, and it sets out the criteria for the environmental aspects, which are now part of a one-stop shop I've described for GM food and feed. And this directive 2001/18 also provides a framework for crop trials, and these are not European decisions, these are national decisions about crop trials, and also for non-food crops. So if you wanted to grow a GM plant that has no food and feed uses, the whole thing would be dealt with under this, and it wouldn't bother our regulation on GM food and feed at all. But a lot of the same principles would be there, and a lot of the same criteria would be applied for environmental risk assessment. And these regulations date from 2001 for the environmental release, 2003 for the authorisation of GM food and feed, and of course nothing stays still, everything is always kept under review. And those of you who follow this carefully will know that there were 2 evaluation reports published at the end of last year by the European Commission covering these 2 pieces of legislation. The Commission's fundamental conclusion is that there are no fundamental flaws in the legislation, but we ought to be implementing them a lot better. And therefore they're looking for various ways to improve the implementation of existing legislation. I'll come to one of those towards the end of this presentation. A lot of it's to do with the efficiency of the process. It's to do with recognising the concerns that a lot of the public and some member states have about GM in general, and how can we deal with that. The Commission's view is very much that we don't need to change the basic legislation, we just need to work smarter and quicker and more efficiently under the existing framework. So, that's out of the way. Let's move on to post-market monitoring. I'll cover 3 things. One is the legislative requirements, how it works in other areas, and then the last one, what the current thinking is. The GM food and feed regulation refers to post-market monitoring at 3 stages in the process. One, what the applicant has to do in relation to it. One, what EFSA has to do when it's evaluating the dossiers for authorisation. And thirdly, what happens at the end. But before we start that, there are recitals to the regulation. The recital is a bit that comes at the start of the regulation. It has no legal force, but it explains why the regulation says what it says. And it can be useful if anybody ever goes to the European Court of Justice to challenge the legislation, because it sets out some of the thinking behind the law. And according to the recitals, this explains why post-market monitoring might be necessary. And the wording is there. It is necessary to introduce, where appropriate, and I've underlined this, it's not in the legislation with underlining, where appropriate and on the basis of the conclusions of the risk assessment, post-market monitoring for the use of GM foods and GM feed. And I should say that's the optional part that says it's only where appropriate. If you've got a live GMO which is going to be imported or which is going to be cultivated in Europe, then post-market monitoring concerning the environmental effects is mandatory. And that's the same as it is under the legislation on deliberate release of GMOs. So, what does the applicant have to do? Well, the dossier shall be accompanied, where appropriate, and again my underlining, a proposal for post-market monitoring. What's where appropriate? We'll find out later. What does EFSA have to do? So if EFSA is giving what is essentially a positive assessment of a GM dossier, where applicable, whatever that means, post-market monitoring requirements based on the outcome of the risk assessment. So the applicant has to propose something. If EFSA thinks it's relevant, and presumably that could be where the applicant thought it was relevant, or it could be in additional cases, then EFSA has to describe post-market monitoring requirements. At the end of the day, if there is a post-market monitoring requirement, this will be included as a condition of the authorisation, and some sort of obligation will be imposed on the authorisation holder. And the person who is given the authorisation is then responsible for submitting reports in accordance with the terms of the authorisation. So the applicant at the start has to propose what might be needed. EFSA can finesse that or introduce post-market monitoring where the applicant hadn't thought it was necessary, and eventually that will all end up as a condition of the authorisation. None of this says what that post-market monitoring might look like. So when we think of the sort of questions that you might ask in post-market monitoring, I've come up with 3 headings. If you've got more, then we can talk about it over cocktails later on. One to do with usage, one to do with exposure of the consumer, either the animal or the person, and the third to do with biological effects. In terms of usage, you could ask, well, how much of this is disappearing into the food or the animal feed supply chain? We could ask which foods would we find this product in, and what would the levels in those foods be? You could then take that a stage further, and I don't think you can ask the second question until you've got the answer to the first one. And who are the people who are going to eat this food, or who are the animals that are going to be consuming this feed, and how much of it would they be eating? And then that can give you an estimate of exposure. I suppose in a few cases you might have a biomarker where you could measure in people's blood or in animals' excreta, for example, the amounts of something which was indicative of how much they've consumed. But I think those cases will be very few, particularly in the GM case. And the third question, and I don't think you can answer the third question until you have an answer to the second one, is this product, a GM food or a GM feed ingredient, for example, having effects on the consumers? And these could be positive effects which were envisaged by the design of the product, or they could be adverse effects, which of course would have implications for food safety. But you can only ask that question sensibly once you know who is being exposed and at what levels. And to answer that, you probably need to know how much is in which foods. So these are the sort of questions you could ask in post-market monitoring, and what would the value of that be to the regulator? Well, it falls in two sides. One is, did we get our risk assessment right at the start? One of the reasons you might want to carry out post-market monitoring is there's something you weren't quite sure about when you carried out the risk assessment. So the product was allowed to go on the market, but we'll keep a very close eye on it and then come back and revisit the risk assessment later on. And the other reason, I guess, for post-market monitoring is saying, well, we recognised that there was some potential question about the product, and we've taken steps to try and control that through labelling of a food for consumers, so that people who are at risk from high levels of something they don't need will be able to avoid that food, for example. We do that for allergy labelling. We know that peanuts will kill some people, but we have very strong labelling rules that manage that risk. And you might want to check your risk management is working, and you could do that through post-market monitoring. And then if it wasn't working, you go back and strengthen or wax your risk management. And I think to help illustrate that, it's useful to look at how it works in other areas. I picked out 3: pesticides, food additives, and novel foods. The regulation of pesticide control requires each member state to have a national monitoring programme. In other words, each member state has to go out, buy a whole load of foods off the shelf and analyse them for various pesticides. The actual analysis that they do is decided based on your national priorities, I guess. But it must include, as a minimum, the EU harmonised programme for specific pesticides in particular foods. So each member state will tackle areas which are felt to be of concern. Now, when you look into the reason for this post-market monitoring, this is primarily to check residues against mandatory limits. Are people using illegal pesticides? Are they using too much of it? Are they not respecting the withdrawal periods and so on? It's not primarily to check people's intake of pesticides, although you can use the data for that purpose. But the purpose is that we want to make sure that the controls are in place to stop people breaking the law. And in some cases, if you find an illegal residue, a high level of permitted pesticide or a non-permitted pesticide, there may of course be health concerns about that, and you'd want to take action to take products off the shelf or whatever. So that's monitoring for pesticides. In the area of food additives, the legislation that we have does include an element of monitoring in 2 ways. This is legislation from 2008 that came into force in 2010, that the European Commission may demand information from producers or users of food additive about the actual amounts. This is because we found it very difficult, we, regulators in general, have found it very difficult in the past to get this kind of data. So we've had to write it into the legislation. You can't just go to the industry and say, do you happen to have any of this data? Because too often they come back and say, well, actually, no, it's going to be too difficult to get it. And the other part of it is that member states must have their own systems for monitoring consumption and use of food additives. And notice the wording here, which I could have underlined but didn't, and saying this is on a risk-based approach. So this is, in other words, this is not for all additives. There are several hundred additives, several thousand flavourings which are approved. And this is on a risk-based approach. In other words, where there's some question about safety. And the purpose of this monitoring is not to check compliance, but the purpose of this monitoring is to check exposure, because a large number of food additives have been approved on the basis of an acceptable daily intake. The levels of use have been set for this additive to be used in this food and that food at this level and that level, with the idea that people would not then exceed the acceptable daily intake. But we need to be able to check that, and there's some cases where it's pretty close to the wire. And the third area of post-market monitoring is novel foods. Now, if you look in the legislation, there's no mention of post-market monitoring at all. But this is rather older legislation, I should say, and it will be updated sometime in the next 2 or 3 years, and it will be made more specific, I guess. But as the legislation stands, it's sufficiently flexible that you can set conditions of use as appropriate for any novel food that's approved under the legislation, and this could include, for example, post-market monitoring. And we actually have 2 examples. One is phytosterols, which were permitted in 2000 as an ingredient in yellow fat spreads. And this is the ingredient you find in Unilever's Flora Proactive branded products, and also now in some other manufacturers' products as well. At the time of the risk assessment, there was an uncertainty. And the uncertainty was because the applicant had said, well, people eat about 25, 30 grams of yellow fat spreads every day. So we'd like to put phytosterols in at 8%, so people will get 2.5, 3 grams a day. And that all sounds very fine. Except, of course, now you have this distinct product on the market with this potential health benefit associated with it because of phytosterols. People might not consume 25 to 30 grams, they might consume 40 to 50 grams because it's so good for them. So the uncertainty in the risk assessment was that the level of consumption of the food in which this product was being added would not change, or would it? So as a result, Unilever, or the applicant, was required to provide a report once the products had been in the market for a reasonable amount of time to be reviewed by the Scientific Committee on Food, which is the predecessor of the current European Food Safety Authority. And if you want to know the outcome, the results were generally reassuring, and in fact we've permitted phytosterols to be added to a whole range of other foods since then. In addition to that, and this is not a requirement of the legislation, it's a choice by individual national authorities. There have been, I'm aware of at least 3 surveys being done in individual member states saying, well, actually we're interested to know how these products are being used by our population to make sure that they're not being used inappropriately, and that's happened in Ireland and the UK, and last year there was a report published from Belgium. As I say, I'm not going to talk too much about how that research was done or what the results were. It's more the idea of where you might use post-market monitoring and what sort of questions you might want to answer. The other example we have on novel foods is lycopene. Lycopene is the red colour that you find in tomatoes, and it is used as a food colour, as a food additive. There are also applications from various companies for it to be used as an ingredient, and this is extracting lycopene sometimes from tomatoes, sometimes making it synthetically, or getting it from other sources, all of which fall under the novel food regulation. Now, the advice that we had was that there is an ADI that's been established for this particular substance, and most users, the average user, would stay below the ADI even if they consumed all the foods that might be on the market with this ingredient in. But, as I said, some users could exceed the ADI. What does the regulator do in that case? Do we say, right, it can't go on the market because some people might exceed an ADI for a short or a longer period? Or do we say, well, overall we think this is reassuring and we'll allow the products to be marketed, but we're going to review it, and we need monitoring data to help us with that review after 3 years? And the second course is the one that we took. The Commission and Member States agreed that the authorisation for lycopene to be added to a whole range of foods and food supplements should proceed, but there should be monitoring. And what's the monitoring? Each applicant who asks for novel food clearance for lycopene has been asked to provide 3 annual reports for the period from 2009 to 2012, covering. Now, it's interesting when you look at this against the shopping list I had earlier of kind of questions you might ask. How much went into the food supply? What food was it in? What were the levels of use, and what are the portion size of those food? That lets the applicant providing the report estimate the intake of lycopene, combined, if possible, with information about its use as a food colour. And of course, the other thing, if there's going to be a re-evaluation of intake, we'd also like to see any new scientific data that's come forward, so it has to put that forward as well. So these are the 2 cases in novel foods where we've decided that there was a question that needed to be answered, and we asked particular applicants when they got the authorisation to provide these data. And that's just my coming back to this question. I think we can see from the examples on pesticides and novel foods and food additives, Post-market monitoring to date has concentrated on the first two of these, but we haven't really had any cause to address the third one, which is about the biological effects of the product on the market. Which takes us back to GM food and feed and where we are with our current discussions on the rather vague references that we have in our GM food and feed legislation to post-market monitoring apart from the environmental monitoring. And the Commission actually has drafted a regulation on requirements for applicants, which is a kind of way of solidifying the EFSA guidance and providing some additional clarity on that. And this covers GM food and feed from GM plants only, because that's where we have all the experience and we're able to be a little bit more specific about what's required. And this includes an article that will clarify these references to post-market monitoring. I just repeated there the text from the legislation that was on the earlier slide. I should stress this is a draft proposal. It's words which the Commission has put on the table for the representatives from Member States and other stakeholders who they've consulted on it to comment. And this does not mean that this text will appear in the final regulation in this form, or possibly at all. But this is where the Commission's thinking is. And I should stress at this point, I should have said it at the start, I'm actually here standing in from somebody from the Commission who wasn't able to come and talk about their proposal and where they are. So don't shoot the messenger, please. What the Commission has said is that the applicant shall submit an appropriate when it is appropriate to confirm. In other words, these are the three cases that the Commission has thought up where it might be appropriate to have post-market monitoring. And if a specific recommendations are used to make sure that these are being respected, in other words, and this is more for the second generation GM foods, I think, rather than the first generation, where there's something specific about it that says that it ought to be used in a particular way or avoided by particular population groups or whatever, to ensure that these kind of recommendations are being respected. And something about predicted consumption, very much in line with what we saw before for novel foods and for food additives. And interestingly, this takes us now into part 3 of my previous slide, which is the effects. This wording has already been questioned. You won't be surprised to hear, because we shouldn't actually be approving foods which have side effects detected in the pre-market risk assessment. And all GM foods, as we saw in the slide very near the beginning, have to not present danger to the consumer. But there's a possibility of checking for effects in the consumers, which can only be further characterised by post-market monitoring. And I guess one case there might be if you think that it's possible, because of the nature of a novel protein, that it might cross-react with something else that we know people are already allergic to. So to be on the safe side, you maybe haven't proved that one way or the other yet. You should allow it on the market, but with this strong labelling, say, if you're allergic to X, don't eat this food. That might turn out to be unnecessary, and only post-market monitoring would really tell you that. On the other hand, it may say that actually there's quite a strong allergic reaction and your risk management is bang on. So, but that's one example maybe of what that is. The Commission goes further to say what sort of thing the applicant might have to provide as a result of post-market monitoring. And here, because the draft is actually very lengthy and the wording is horrible, I've just summarised really what these three conclusions are. Post-market monitoring shall identify adverse effects that may be related to consumption of GM food and feed, and that's sort of the rationale for it. If you're not going to be able to provide that information, then you shouldn't be doing it. The information should be collected from any relevant stakeholder, and that includes consumers about their own personal habits, and it may involve particular foods that are of interest or particular population groups, for example, particular age groups that might be felt to be at risk from some adverse effect. And of course, if you're going to provide data as a result of your post-market monitoring, we want that to be explained and thoroughly described. My comment at the bottom here, and this is very much my comment, not the part of the Commission's draft proposal, is it's really difficult for an applicant to do this. This whole text that we're talking about, the Commission's draft proposal, is to help applicants write their applications better so that they can sail through the system more efficiently. And the applicant has to decide at the start, what's EFSA going to say about the type of risk or the uncertainty in my dossier, and how am I going to design post-market monitoring to address EFSA's concerns that I don't know yet. So putting all of this down in a document addressed at applicants is really an odd thing to do in my mind. But on the other hand, it's the only place the Commission has to put this down. And it does give a clear indication of the areas where the Commission, and if the document is adopted by Member States, this is an implementing act I talked about earlier, so it's only the Member States that are looking at it. This will be a clear consensus view from Member States about what post-market monitoring is supposed to be about. So there we are. I hope that wasn't too much of a disappointment, keeping you from cocktails down the road at the Institute Francais, but I hope it's given a bit of a background to the discussion that will take place tomorrow and again on the last day of the conference.
Thank you very much. Then I think we kind of have touched upon all important issues underlying our project, and this was certainly very to the point and necessary for us to get an introduction to. Should we give possibilities for a couple of yes, for comments, questions? 7:30, so we have an hour. We have an hour? Cocktails are 7:30. Cocktail is 7:30. Is that here? It's like a 10-minute walk. Okay. So we then just to ask questions if you have, or comments if you still are awake. So I think Goodman first. Oh.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks for the excellent overview. Sometimes a little bit disappointed, in particular in the end, I must say, but when you started, and I thought before I saw the last slide, I would like to ask you if we both would agree that for the overwhelming majority of the product that we have in the market, no such monitoring would be appropriate, referring to the residual 35 and the 829, since that is what made me quite confident that this reference here brings us to a point where even the Commission would recognize that this isn't this is not really appropriate in every case to ask for monitoring. But seeing the last slide, I was a little bit, yeah, so I don't think that we both should agree or could agree that under the Commission's point of view, the overwhelming majority of products would not fall under any monitoring requirement for food feed. If you understood what I mean.
There's several negatives in that last question, but trying to look up where we came out at the end of it. No, I think the Commission would agree with you and with me, and I hope with most other people, that post-market monitoring is not a routine activity. It's only where there is a specific issue that's arisen as part of a risk assessment. And there's nothing in the risk assessments to date that I can think of which would trigger. I mean, the Commission is not trying to say something new here, saying this is a change in our policy. They're just simply trying to provide a bit more clarity on something which is very non-specific in the legislation. This, where appropriate, the applicant shall propose post-market monitoring, and it does make it clear that it's going to be it's going to be only in specific cases. And I think when we start seeing the products which are not substantially equivalent to the foods they might replace, or a GM food which has no traditional counterpart, then some of these questions might start to be relevant, but not for the products we've looked at until now. Does that reassure you?
Yes.
This sounds very good, and I haven't been involved in actual applications since 2004, and I really not directly with EFSA, but I've had interactions doing studies for people on a consulting basis. And what worries me a bit is not knowing the mechanisms and the definitions, and it seems as if things keep getting added even without guidance. So, and we could talk about it for a while, about endogenous allergenicity assessment, we could, and we would spend some time talking about it. But, you know, there seems to be pretty good data submitted to EFSA, and then the EFSA panel asks for more data, and maybe at times even seems to give a spin on the what the document, the guideline really says, and kind of asks for data beyond what the guideline says. So when I see that and I see this, then what worries me is that if it's the EFSA panel without further guidance that can ask for PMM, then I could foresee them asking for it on a number of today's products that are in the line to be approved or denied.
Well, in a way, this proposal, which the Commission is talking about, provides that guidance to EFSA as well, by saying we, as the people who've commissioned you to carry out the risk evaluation, if you like, we, the risk managers, are saying this is the kind of case where we would anticipate post-market monitoring being relevant. So if there are no specific recommendations of use of a product, it's not argued against for particular levels to be added, it'd be limited to particular foods or particular species or particular groups of human consumers, then that wouldn't apply. If there's no quantitative assessment as part of the GM evaluation, GM food evaluation, saying that we're happy up to this level but not beyond, then the second one doesn't apply. And if you haven't identified any potential effects as part of the pre-market risk assessment, then again, there's no case to be answered. So, on the other hand, if one or more of these cases apply, then you could say, yeah, there's a case here for making sure that this works in practice. As we have done in other areas, as I've tried to show for food additives and for novel foods, where we've had a question that needs to be answered or monitoring that needs to be carried out on an ongoing basis about exposure levels, then we do that, and it's no different for GM.
Well, as a follow-up, I could suggest that sometimes surrogates are used. So if the concern is allergenicity, sometimes the surrogate marker of IgE binding, some people would view as evidence of allergy when it's not. It's really sensitization that could possibly be something, but there's no absolute level that you can say, above this level, you are going to cause allergy, below this level, you will not. And so that is a big gray area open for interpretation.
Well, you know, just
what Richard says is true. I mean, there's some questions from an allergy point of view, but I wanted to switch from food to drugs. So with drugs and post-market monitoring, it's much easier because you go to your doctor says, here, take this drug, and a week later the patient comes back and says, oops, something terrible is happening to me. And so you have a good reporting system. The doctor reports it to the company and so forth. What you said before about post-market monitoring being decided based on pre-market risk is a bit of a worry, because in some cases from pre-market risk in the drug world, everything was great. They did these fantastic studies, they've got great drugs on the market, and then, oops, something bad happens, and the drug is taken away. So my question is more about that decision making. So how are you going to make, or how do you foresee making a decision based on pre-market risk when everything's fine, not to do post-market risk? I think that's kind of a difficult thing. When do you decide to do post-market risk or analysis, or surveillance, sorry?
Yeah.
Who decides it?
Two things. One, the comparison with monitoring for drugs, you're right, it's a lot easier for medicines given under prescription. I think that will come up tomorrow when we have presentations in the afternoons. I was trying to concentrate more on the why rather than the how at this stage. And in terms of whether any new thing added into food might be a candidate for post-market monitoring, you could say the same about a new food additive, for example, or a new pesticide that, well, we think that this is acceptable, but we might be wrong, so maybe we need to carry out some sort of formal post-market monitoring for it. I think we have to be a lot more confident in the risk assessments that we carry out. There's always room for more research, and so we have the GMSAFOOD project, for example, so we can carry out individual pieces of research, which is different to ongoing monitoring day in, day out. And I'd like to draw that distinction. So if there is new scientific evidence that says, oh, for this class of compound, or this class of GM food, or this class of pesticide, or whatever, there could be something we hadn't thought of in our risk assessment, you can commission more research, you can carry out a review. But that's different to saying on day one, we put this on the market, but we might be wrong, you know, and so we want to carry out post-market monitoring. The thing I would point out is that when you have pharmaceuticals, they are designed to have a definite interaction with mammalian physiology and biology. And the chances that that might have some unforeseen consequence, or there could be an interaction with another system you haven't thought of, or maybe in some particular disease state, there are big uncertainties there. But you can offset that against a big benefit from the product for the people that the drug's going to help. So the whole landscape of making the decision to authorize the product in the first place is quite different. And you would tolerate an uncertainty and a risk for a pharmaceutical that you would not tolerate for a GM food or for a food additive or for any other kind of novel food.
Actually, your point is well taken. The idea that it's a matter of looking at it from a research point of view versus an everyday management or risk management, so to speak. And that's a big issue. Yeah,
of course, as a veterinarian, I guess my viewpoint in the whole GM exposure is that animals get the same diet formulation over time, on a daily basis, several times a day. Their exposure is generally higher. I think we discussed it in the project a little bit, is that what about using livestock and as a monitoring tool?
So using
livestock and the health authorities, food animal health authorities in various countries in the EU and Europe, they're fairly well organized. Maybe using them as a monitoring system to continue to look at possible long-term effects. Is that something you...
Again, we're talking about the how rather than the why. Sure. But I guess there's possibilities there. You're right in that the exposure tends to be more consistent, assuming that the same GM event is present in the feed at all times.
And as long as we keep labeling foods and feeds, or especially feeds, then they may contain them. And try to monitor on a regular basis.
I don't know that you can monitor individual events through that mechanism. Yes, it's a possibility. And I mean, I don't know what happens at the moment with other feed additives and the other feed ingredients that are evaluated and approved by the...
Feed additives are perhaps the human versus the animal part of things this much. But with the GM feed ingredients, the animals may serve as an interesting monitoring tool and post-market monitoring. And if something's going on with the livestock and the veterinarian is told to, well, keep an eye on it in various countries. I mean, the veterinary medicine has become population medicine, not individual medicine, at least for livestock. So it's a possibility that...
It's certainly a possibility, yes.